Sophia?
Sorry, we're good. I'm putting it live now. Let me just...
Okay, let me know when I can start.
Okay, it's almost up. And we are live.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone. My name is Ophir Diane. I'm the president of SSI at Columbia University. And today I'm going to be giving a short talk about the status quo of the Temple Mount. And I will be speaking about what the hell is happening in the most controversial place on earth. I'm sure that we all heard about the Temple Mount in different contexts, and I'm sure we all heard it. It's a very controversial place where a lot of trouble are happening and a lot of infighting between Jews and Arabs. But today, I think we should really dive in and try to understand how we got to the situation we're in right now and what is the situation we're in right now. So just before we start, a short disclaimer. I do that in all of my lectures. SSI is not a political movement, not SSI National, also not SSI Columbia. Most of this presentation, I was trying to stick to just facts. But if at some point during the presentation you think that you hear a view, that is my own personal view and not the view of SSI. Let's start with a bit of a background. So what is the Temple Mount? The Temple Mount is the place where the first and second Jewish temples used to stand. The first temple from 930 to 970, it was built between 930 and 970 until 586 BCE, and was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then the second temple is built shortly after at 516 BCE, and it lasted until 70 AD. At which point it was destroyed by the Romans. If you celebrated some of the Jewish holidays, you probably know that at 70 AD, the Jews revolt against the Roman occupiers of the land. A revolution that sadly doesn't succeed as planned, and the Jews are exiled and their temple is destructed. The picture you can see here is how the temple is presumed to have looked like in these eras. So the temple was a religious, spiritual, national center of the Jews. The temple was a place where Jews obviously came to pray on special holidays. It was the place to which they brought sacrifices for God, but it was also a place where Jews assembled. It was a place where Jews, during the time of mourning, when someone dear to them died, they went to, and there's even detailed customs of how people who are mourning go in one direction and the other people go in a different direction, so they can meet them and console them. So it wasn't just a religious center, it was a place of worship, but also a place of gathering with your brethren. And around this temple, evolved a culture of markets and all other things that are related to communal meetings. Why there? The Jewish temple could have been built on any place on earth. That's not true. The reason that this specific mountain in Jerusalem, Mount Moriah, was chosen to be the home of the temple is that there's a few reasons. First of all, the foundation rock, the rock from which it is said that the entire world stemmed from, is in this place, right where the temple is. And we'll speak about where it is now. And it is where Abraham brought Isaac to in the famous story where Abraham was told by God that he needs to sacrifice his son. I'm sure most of you are aware of the story, and then it ended up, he ended up dodging that bullet and not being sacrificed. So this is the same place where both of these things happened. We can't deny that Judaism is not the only religion, group, ethnicity that has certain roots in the Temple Mount or see the Temple Mount as significant. significant. In Islam, this is the place from which Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven with the angel Gabriel on Laylatul Qadr, the famous night, the third holiest place in Islam after Mecca, where in Saudi Arabia, and Medina, the two cities in which Muhammad lived in Saudi Arabia. Also in Islam, in 622 AD, Muhammad instructed his followers to pray towards the prayer direction of the Jews. This is how it's described in the Quran, aka towards the Temple Mount. It was reversed a year and a half later, and as you can see in the picture, I don't know if it's what screen are you looking at, if it's a computer or a cell phone, but if it's a big enough screen, you can see that their heads are not directed towards the Dome of the Rock, where the foundation rock is, where the temple used to be, but to the other direction, the direction of the Aleksa Mosque and Mecca. During the Muslim conquest of the region, a converted Jew told the Muslim ruler where the foundation rock was. So this ruler built the Dome of the Rock, what we now know as this beautiful structure with a golden dome. Not to be confused, this is not the Golden Dome, it is the Dome of the Rock. And a converted Jew tells the Muslim ruler that the Dome of the Rock was there, and the foundation rock was there, and the Muslim ruler decides to build that structure to protect the rock. Interestingly enough, it was not always golden. It's only golden in the past few decades. The compound it's very interesting because when we hear about it in the news, we imagine this tiny, tiny, tiny compound where everything is super dense, everything is stressed, everyone's crammed together, fighting between them, but that's not the case. The compound of the Temple Mount is 37 acres. It's not a small place by any means. You can see it in the picture. And there are several buildings on this ramp, on this compound. So obviously the Aleksa Mosque, it is where you can probably, it's next to the blue one. If you look to the right of it, you see a structure with a gray dome. This is the Aleksa Mosque. Then the Dome of the Rock is the one that you all recognize with the golden dome, and Solomon's Tables, which is to the right of the Aleksa Mosque. And it's very interesting. And in Solomon's Tables, which is underground, they build now the largest mosque in the Middle East. It's 10,000, I think, prayer spots. It's underground. It's really, really huge. And it's right there. In terms of gates, we all know that there are gates to the old city. All these gates were built to lead people into the Temple Mount, into the temple when it stood there. So right now, the situation is kind of weird. Jews and tourists who are not Muslims are allowed to enter through the gate that is marked with the number 1. All the other gates are for Muslims only. And there is one gate, the Mercy Gate or the Golden Gate, which is the gate that you see written Shara Hamim in white on the right side, the upper right side of the picture, which is blocked. The reason that the Golden Gate is blocked is because this is the gate through which, according to Jewish tradition, the Messiah is supposed to enter through when he comes to redeem the Jewish people. And in the past, the Muslims thought that, in order to prevent the Messiah from entering Jerusalem, they would just seal the gate, and this is what they did. It is sealed until this day. The gate has two main parts, so the gate itself and a small indoor space. I don't know if you heard about it in the news, but there has been a lot of news segments about it recently because the Muslim Waqf and other Muslims took over that compound of the Golden Gate, the Mercy Gate. and erected a mosque there against the ruling of the court, the Israeli court, but that mosque is in place even today as we speak. In terms of management, who is managing this site? So in 1967, Israel got hold, liberated Jerusalem, and that included the Temple Mount. This is the moment where, we all know that very emotional moment where the Israeli soldiers are weeping and crying and screaming, the Temple Mount is in our hands. But then a short time after that, a very distant relative of mine, Moshe Dayan, decides that I will translate it freely, that we don't need this Vatican. We don't need this sacred place. We don't need, all of the things that come, the responsibility that comes with it. And he decides to hand the keys, quite literally, to the Jordanian Waqf. What is the Jordanian Waqf? The Jordanian Waqf is a body, obviously, as implied by the name, of Jordanian officials, who is in charge of, administering practically everything on the Temple Mount, but security. The security is taken care of by the Israeli police, who is trying to be sensitive and stations mostly Druze and Muslim policemen on the Temple Mount, policemen and women. And the Jordanian Waqf is in charge of everything else. So the picture you see now is is very recent. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Waqf was in charge of disinfecting the mosques and the compound. The Waqf is in charge of enforcing the rules. So the Waqf does not have any authority to arrest an Israeli on the Temple Mount. But for example, if an Israeli is breaking one of the many rules that there are on Israelis, and we'll get to it soon, the Waqf would direct the police officer's attention and they would arrest him. The Waqf, though, does have the authority to expel people from the Temple Mount, mainly tourists. And as I said, the Israeli police mostly is in charge of the Jewish people who ascend to the Temple Mount. And in case of a huge riot, which is something that happens every now and then, or a terrorist attack, the Israeli police would go in and take over and manage the situation. We like to talk about religious freedom in Israel. This is one of our main talking points in the pro-Israel world. And the Temple Mount, I think, is one of the most important places for that, because this is really the place where, everyone, like in Jerusalem in general, every major monotheistic religion has its roots. And in terms of the Temple Mount, it's mostly Jews and Muslims. Christians don't really have, unless I'm wrong, I might be wrong, and I would love to hear about that in the comments. Christians do not have a very deep connection to the Temple Mount, but Muslims are generally allowed to pray and walk in all areas of the compound. Tourists, meaning everyone who is not Muslim and Jews, are allowed to walk in all areas but not pray. And the Jews are allowed to walk only in some areas, unless they don't identify themselves as Jews. So if they want to ascend to the Temple Mount without wearing a yarmulke or any Jewish symbol, and practically say they're tourists and don't speak Hebrew, they might be able to get away with that, but that's just like a way around it. Generally, Jews are allowed to walk only in some areas, escorted by police, as you see in this picture, and they are not allowed to pray whatsoever on the Temple Mount. And my question to you, to provoke thinking, again, I will try not to say my personal opinion, but have we taken it too far? Maybe we said, we believe in religious freedom for everyone, and we kind of forgot ourselves in that process. This is a question that I encourage you to think about. And now I want to show you two short videos. I will start with a video on the right. This is, just for context, a Christian who ascended to the Temple Mount. He is on the ramp, so the Dome of the Rock would be to his right. And he kneels on the floor and is praying. And this is what happens when a Waqf person approaches him. I hope you can hear the sound.
Keep going. What are you doing? Praying, yes? This is a church or mosque. Where are you now? Where are you? In the church or in the mosque? There's nothing but mosque. This is called Aleksa Mosque for us. You come here and disrespect our Islamic religion. You're not even respectful of us here. You're not welcome to be here. Jesus teaches to respect each other. You're not doing it. I don't want to check your hand. You have to leave outside. Now, listen.
So I hope you could hear the sound. If not, I will just briefly describe the video. So a Christian tourist ascended to the Temple Mount. He is praying next to the Dome of the Rock, and a Jordanian Waqf officer approaches him, says, "What are you doing? Are you praying?" He says, "Yes." And he says, "Oh, where are you? Are you in a mosque or in a church?" And the guy says something not very clear. I think he said the Temple Mount or something like that. And he says, "No, like, you will respect us. You can pray here." The guy apologizes, gets up, tries to shake the Waqf officer's hand, and he refuses to shake his hand. And that guy was kicked out of the compound. The second video I want to show you is of a Jewish person who ascended to the Temple Mount. As you can see, he's more securely, there's more security around him. You can see the police officer here, and the guy with the hat. Both of them are wearing hats. So one of them is a police officer, and the other one, for context, because it's in Hebrew, he's a guy who is picking up trash from the floor because he claimed that, he believed that this place is holy, and it was very bothered by the trash on the floor. So the police officer asked what he's doing. He said, "I'm picking up trash." The police officer is saying, "Is it your job?" He said, "No, but there is glass on the floor, so I wanted to pick it up." He asked him to show him all the garbage he collected. He apologizes for taking it. Another police officer is approaching. Another person is trying to intervene and stop the police officer from arresting him. The police officer claims that he's not allowed to pick up garbage because it causes provocations, and the guy is arrested by the police. Mind you, he is an Israeli citizen. It is the Israeli police. Okay, we will move on. These are, the easier stuff that we can talk about. Now I want to move really to the hardcore issues. Terrorism. Every few months, policemen and women are being attacked, including an attack which killed two policemen, Hail Stavi and Kamil Sha'anan, a few years ago. There are Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad marches every Friday after the prayers on the Temple Mount. Something very important that I forgot to say, Jews and tourists are allowed on the Temple Mount only from Sunday to Thursday, from 7:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. and then again from 1:30 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. So really minimal hours, while those who are Muslim are allowed to be on the Temple Mount in all hours of the day. And during Friday, when when Jews and tourists are not allowed on the Temple Mount, there are marches, carrying Hamas flags. And these terror attacks that I mentioned mostly happen during these days where Jews are not present there, because it's easier for the terrorists. Obviously, I think I don't need to say that, but the vast majority of the Muslims who come to the Temple Mount are not terrorists. They're normal people who come there to pray. But on the occasions where Jews are not allowed on the Temple Mount, it is easier for those who are involved in terrorism to hide and use weapons on the Temple Mount, because it is less restrictive. There is less Israeli police, etc. Israel tried fighting this and tried installing metal detectors in the different gates through which Muslims enter the Temple Mount, but it caused a wave of violence and threats from certain sects and they were removed. Just for context, on the one gate through which tourists and Israelis and Jews are allowed to enter the Temple Mount, there is metal detectors, and people go through them. So what's next? Where is it standing now? What we're going to do for the future. So there have been several court cases around the issue. And when I say the issue, I mean the issue of Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount and Jewish restrictions. It's not, I talked about prayer and picking up garbage and stuff like that, but the list goes on and on. It is not coded in law in Israel, so it's very arbitrary. The police officer on duty can basically arrest you or take you to the police station for anything they see fit under the clause of causing provocations. It's not written anywhere, so you never know if you're allowed or not allowed to do something. If you're interested, I once wrote an article rating the 10 most bizarre reasons for which Jews were arrested on Temple Mount. Would love to send it to you if you're interested. There are really bizarre things. I know people who were arrested on their wedding day because the man placed a ring on his wife's finger on the Temple Mount, stuff like that, stuff that are really absurd. And people filed court cases in the Israeli Supreme Court against what they perceive as discrimination against Jews in this holy site. And this obviously led many organizations on both sides to get involved in the issues. But Israelis generally don't really care. It's not on the agenda. It's not in the news most of the time, unless there is a major terror attack or riots or something like that. Most Israelis don't really think about it in their day-to-day life, and that means that their government doesn't really care either. Now there is a new Minister of Homeland Security who is in charge of police. We are witnessing some differences. For example, when on last Sunday, when the Jordanian Waqf decided to give a eulogy to the CEO of the Islamic Jihad, the terror organization, recognized terror organization by Israel, US, European Union, etc. Their CEO, who was on the FBI most wanted list, passed away, and the Waqf decided to give a eulogy on the Temple Mount. The minister decided to issue a warrant through the police, of course, banning the person who gave the eulogy from entering the Temple Mount for 5 months on the basis of support for terrorism. So we do see slight changes, but on the whole, Israel, it's not fair to say that Israelis care very much about this issue. It annoys them, but it's not one of the top issues on the agenda of most Israelis. At the same time, before we conclude, I do want to say that it seemed very bleak the way I presented it. I do think that since this is a pro-Israel organization, we should be able to criticize Israel or know the things that Israel is doing that are not as simple and not as, the things, things like that are a bit more complicated. That doesn't mean that, maybe it's the right thing to do. I don't know. I'm not going to voice my opinion here. Maybe the concern for public safety is more important than the right of Jews to pray on the Temple Mount. Maybe it's not. It will be for you to decide. Maybe, not enraging the entire Muslim world would be more important than the right of the Jews to pray there. I don't know. I'm not going to voice my opinion. These are questions I'm going to leave open to you. And speaking of questions, I would love to hear any questions you might have. I don't know how you want to do this, Sophia, if you want to read out the questions or you want people to just ask away. In any case, it is important for me to say that this is recorded and is going to be posted on YouTube and is posted live on Facebook. So if you don't feel comfortable people hearing you asking a question or having your name read out when you ask a question, please don't be shy. It's fine. You can write it in the chat and then we won't read your name or on Facebook. And before I open this to Q&A, all my contact information is right here: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email. If you need my phone number, that's also fine. Please message me on this chat or on any other outlet. I would love to continue talking about that or any other issue. So please follow SSI Colombia on Facebook and Instagram and me. And if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. Let's go.
If you guys want to ask, just unmute yourself. You have that capability. And then if you don't feel comfortable asking your question, just type it out and I can read it out loud to Ophir.
Sure, I got a question. Why not? I joined kind of late, Ophir, but I don't know if you know the reason. How come anyone has to go through security still when you go to the Western Wall, but they don't have metal detectors or anything when you go to the Temple Mount?
So, okay, so this is an interesting question. So, I assume not all of you visited the Temple Mount. I'm sure most of you haven't, but also the Western Wall, I'm sure some of you haven't. So when you go to the Western Wall, there are metal detectors. As I said earlier, there are metal detectors and other security measures when you ascend to the Temple Mount as a Jew or as a tourist. On the Muslim gates, there is no security. The reason is honestly just the power of inertia. They never did it, and when they did, it was way too late. It was after a major terror attack that I just mentioned, the murder of Camille Shannon and Ail Stawi, and the spirits were already very, people were already very upset and violence already erupted. So when they tried putting the metal detectors, it was already way too late, and stuff that we didn't do for 50 years. It's very hard to do now. So that's the reason there are no metal detectors in the gates through which the Muslims enter. There is, though, police officers and policemen and women who are standing in these gates. They are supposed to, stall everyone who they deem suspicious. I wouldn't say it works 100% of the time. And I would also say that the major problem is not people entering the Temple Mount, it's people leaving the Temple Mount, because in many of the terror attacks in recent years, what we have seen is that people hide weapons inside the Temple Mount, in the Dome of the Rock, or in the Aleksa Mosque, or in Solomon's Stables, or in the Mercy Gate, or wherever they might hide them. There is also an Islamic girls' school on the elementary school on the Temple Mount. So they hide these weapons there. And then the problem is when they come out with these weapons. And then it's a bit more problematic, because it's not like the police officers can really stop them going in, because they're coming out and they're behind their backs. Okay, I see that there are a few. Yeah, sorry. Anyone else?
We have
okay.
a couple.
Yeah. Sophia, do you want to read out the questions, or do you want me to?
Whichever. Would you like?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So, when any actions are being undertaken to confront the Waqf, given their affiliation with promoting terrorism, is it difficult to do it, given that it is technically a foreign body?
Okay, that's a very important question. So the Waqf is a foreign body. It's a Jordanian body. It is interesting because in the last year or so, there have been two waves of rumors, one of which the earlier one mentioned the Jordanians wanting to bringing Palestinians into the Waqf, and the second one was very recent, in the last, I think, 2 weeks, about the Saudis wanting to take part in the Waqf, and the Jordanian being willing to negotiate that. It is very hard. The reason that it is very hard to minimize the Waqf influence in the Temple Mount is just because Israel created this. Israel was the one to say, hey, we don't want to administrate this, the Vatican, so do it you. And when Israel is the one to forgo the right to manage the holiest site in Judaism, it is very hard again to, 50 years later to wake up one morning and say, you know what, we created a monster that has way too much power now. This is very problematic now. Again, Israel and Jordan, they have a peace agreement. So this is also something that makes it very difficult. Every infringement on the authorities or the power the Waqf gave itself or took on throughout the years would cause, disturbance and, unease with the Jordanian side. And I don't think Israel is willing to jeopardize the peace agreement with Jordan for that.
Thank you, Ophir. So the next question is, Israelis are very against going up to the Temple Mount. Can you elaborate more on why they feel that way?
Yes, so thank you. That's a very important question. I should have addressed that in my presentation. So there are several reasons, and each reason vaguely corresponds to a different sect in Israeli society. So the Orthodox Jews, more traditional Orthodox Jews, believe that in this day we are not pure enough to ascend to the Temple Mount. I'm not gonna, tire you with all the details, but basically in order to be pure enough, there are a few conditions. You need to have a red cow and burn it, and the ashes should purify you, and a few other things that it is believed that we don't have these days. And the most important of them is that we are all exposed to dead people or cemeteries, and that means we're not pure enough to ascend to the Temple Mount. So that's the very orthodox point of view about why Jews should not ascend to the Temple Mount. That does not mean that Orthodox Jews does not ascend. Even ultra-Orthodox Jews ascend to the Temple Mount. Usually when I ascend to the Temple Mount, and I try to do that at least once a week when I'm in Israel, most of the people who ascend are Orthodox Jews. The reason that they allow themselves to do that is, first of all, that many rabbis today allow it. But the reason the rabbis allow it is because the path on which the Jews are allowed to walk, I mentioned earlier that Jews are led by the police on the Temple Mount, and the areas in which they are allowed to walk by the police are areas that researchers and archaeologists confirmed were not a part of the Holy of Holies, the place that we are not pure enough to go into. So that's one reason, and that's the Orthodox viewpoint. But again, it is eroding to a large extent, and many Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews today trust archaeologists and scientists and know that if they're ascending to the Temple Mount, they're not stepping in places where halachically they shouldn't be. But a lot of other people, first of all, I think it has to do with fear. Many people hear about the Temple Mount only when there is, as I said, riot or a terror attack. So they're just legitimately scared. And until, organizations and NGOs who are involved in promoting awareness to the Temple Mount don't do a better job in educating people and making them see that it's not dangerous, I can understand why people are afraid. And also, some people just don't feel that connection. For them, the Western Wall is enough. It is to them a remnant of the temple. I don't want to break your hearts, but it's not. It is an exterior wall that was not a part of the temple. But for many Israelis and Jews, it is enough. It's good enough for them. And they don't feel the need to ascend to the actual place.
Thank you.
And I'm sure there are other reasons as well that I haven't mentioned, but these are, I think, the main ones.
So the next question is kind of broad, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but why do people not even know the basic fact that Jews are not allowed to pray there? Some people think that Jews unfairly control the area, but they don't even know that the rules against Jews on the Temple Mount are much stricter against Jews than against Muslims. If people understood that the area is the holiest to Jews, but that Muslims have more rights there than Jews do, maybe they couldn't keep criticizing Israel for what it does there. including security measures that protect Muslims as well?
Okay, so first of all, I think the last sentence was super important. The security measures are not there to only, protect Jews. When there is a terror attack, when there is a terrorist running around with a gun or with a knife, it endangers everyone, not just Jews. Obviously, it endangers, the police officers more because they're an easier target, but it endangers everyone. So it is important to understand that Israel is keeping everyone safe there. The reason I think people are not aware of it is, it has to do a lot with education, like everything. I'm a big believer that people, know what they're being taught, and they believe what they have been raised to think and believe. And today, the Israeli school system is, I went to a secular school for 12 years, my entire, school life, and I have never heard of the Temple Mount. Not even once. I mean, maybe in Bible class when they talked about, the temple and about the story of Isaac, but there was never a connection made between these stories and the Temple Mount. It was just like, this amorphic place. And the Israeli school system, at least a secular one, which is the bigger one, doesn't really do a good job in educating people about this. And as I said, since not many people care about it in Israel, there are no many other avenues through which people can get educated about this issue. It's not like youth movements or NGOs or the media speak about that. This is, it got sidelined. And when people don't talk about it, people don't know. And this is one of the reasons I decided to give this lecture, because I do believe it is very important for people to be aware of this, whether they want to ascend or not, whether they think Israel should have control over the Temple Mount or give it up for peace, whether they think Jews should be allowed to pray there or not, pick garbage or not, sing a tikva or not. That's for you to decide. But knowing the facts is the first and most basic step, no matter what you end up thinking.
All right, the next question is it possible to bring any kind of prayer book or any other religious material on the Temple Mount, even if it's non-Jewish? For example, can a Buddhist bring his or her religious book there and pray?
So as I said earlier, it's not coded into law, so we don't know. I mean, there's no book saying, you can bring that or you can't bring that. It's very arbitrary. It's very up to, the police officer stationed there at the moment. And let's say it this way, in their briefings, it's kind of a weird word to use for civilians, but civilians are briefed before they ascend to the Temple Mount, both tourists and Jews, and Jewish religious artifacts are always mentioned to be prohibited. In most cases, also other religions' prayer books are prohibited. But for example, an Israeli flag is also always mentioned to not be allowed on the Temple Mount, but other flags are allowed. But again, making it more complicated, when someone flew the American flag on the Temple Mount, he was arrested. So I think the main issue is that there is not like a set of rules that we can actually know what is allowed and what is not. It's a very big issue, so people don't really know what they're allowed to do. And I can just recommend a video if you want. I can send it to you later, of a group of people who went to the Temple Mount, a group of Jewish activists, and they brought a huge bag with a lot of artifacts, trying to see what will make the selection, what won't, like what would be allowed, what won't. And I'm not going to spoil it for you. It's very funny, but the results are very surprising. I'll just give one highlight. It was in Hanukkah, and a sufganiya, the pastry, was not allowed because it's a religious artifact. But I don't know, a tiny cacti was allowed, like a succulent was allowed. So it's very, very arbitrary. I see that there is one question on the Facebook Live, and it's a super, super, super important question, so I would really like to address it. Someone asked, how can Israel protect the area from damage to archaeological evidence? I understand the Waqf allows such destruction or even encourages it. So this is something that is super important to me to mention. During Ehud Barak's term as prime minister, the huge mosque I mentioned in Solomon's Tables was built, and it wasn't an empty space before. So there were a lot of religious archaeological artifacts belonging to the temple, both of them in that area, and it was built during the time of the Ramadan, which usually is a time where Jews are not allowed to enter the Temple Mount, as in most other Muslim holidays. So there was a huge controversy around archaeological evidence and artifacts being taken away and thrown into the garbage, and just being just disappeared in all very creative ways. This is a true concern. I mean, it happened last year again during Ramadan, when the Waqf encouraged or turned a blind eye when people on the Temple Mount, while Jews were not allowed in, shattered and broke archaeological artifacts. It's extremely sad. It's not about religion. It's not about, rights or, this guy or this girl is praying or not. It's about just heritage and science. And to me, it's really sad. I do want to mention one case that I think symbolizes this better than anything. So during an earthquake in the early last century, a few wooden poles fell off the roof of the Aleksa Mosque, and they were taken to be to check the carbon to date them, and it was discovered that they belonged to the first temple. Okay, there were poles that were used to build the first temple, and they were stored in the roof of the Aleksa Mosque and were discovered only when an earthquake hit Jerusalem. In any case, it is a very, very important artifact in all opinions. It was dated, even if you don't believe in that the temple ever stood there, it was dated to the years of the temple. It's very important. And these poles are there today, laying in the sun, in the rain, outside next to the Mercy Gate, because the bureaucracy and the outrage it would cause to move them somewhere else is too large and too scary for the government to allow them to be moved. So they're just laying there, getting rotten outside. So this is, to me, something that really symbolizes this issue, and it's really, really sad, and everyone who is concerned about preserving heritage and archaeology should be very concerned. Anyone else? You can just unmute yourself or write in the chat. Okay.
All right.
So I think we'll conclude here. Thank you all very much for joining me. Again, if you have any more questions or just want to chat about this or any other issue, if you need any of the materials that I described or any of the references to the things I talked about in this presentation, there is right here. You can take a screenshot, my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and email. Feel really free to reach out to me. I'm super available. The people here who are on my board can attest to the fact that my phone does not leave my hand, so I will answer you promptly. So please feel free to do that.
Thank you, Ophir.
Thanks, Ophir.
And
thank you, Ophir.
everybody should tune in on Thursday, June 18th. Romy will be from SSI Columbia, will be giving a talk on anti-Israel sentiment in Jewish schools at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern time. So tune in.
It's great. And I'm not biased.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ophir. Thank you.